It is my pleasure to introduce our next keynote, the Honorable James Comey. Director Comey has served as an assistant U.S. attorney for both the Southern District of New York and the Eastern District of Virginia. He has also served as the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, and in 2003 became the Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice. In 2005, he became General Counsel and Senior Vice President at Lockheed Martin. And 5 years later, he joined Bridgewater Associates, a Connecticut-based investment fund, as its general counsel. On September 4th, 2013, he was sworn in as the 7th director of the FBI. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the stage the FBI director.
Thanks so much, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for giving me a chance to share with you some thoughts on behalf of the FBI about all things cyber, and then I'd be happy to take questions after I've shared these thoughts. So let me start by talking about the threat and how, from the FBI's perspective, we see and slice the threat actors, how they're coming at us, and what they're after. We divide it into 5 groups. There's lots of different ways to think about this, but our 5 groups are the nation states. Think China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. The second group is international criminal syndicates. We've seen a significant increase in the size and sophistication of those who are looking to steal information simply to sell it to the highest bidder. The third category that we think of the threat through is the purveyors of ransomware, which is spreading like a virus across the United States and other parts of the world. The fourth group are the hacktivists. That is a motley collection of people who are engaging in computer intrusions for all manner of motivations, some political, some to harass, some financially related. And then the last bucket is the terrorists. Terrorists have become highly proficient at using the internet to sell their message and to recruit and plan for attacks. They're quite literally buzzing in the pockets of people to try and make them followers all around the world. There's no doubt that terrorists aspire to use the internet to engage in computer intrusions, to get into our systems for all kinds of bad reasons, but we don't see them there yet. But because the logic of terrorism and the internet is what it is, that's a threat we constantly worry about. So those are the 5 ways in which we divide up the threat actors who are coming at us through computer intrusions. So how are they operating? Increasingly, we are seeing them mounting attacks on larger targets, combining multiple techniques, and often exploiting significant inside knowledge of their target. They're using social engineering to come after all of us, whether that is the government, the private sector, academia, and they're using social media to target employees of our institutions in order to try and engineer a way into a system. Every bit of information for these groups of actors is a nugget of gold. Every bit of information can be leveraged to gain access. And what are they after? Information, access, advantage, money, all kinds of things. And increasingly, we are worried not just about the loss of data, but the potential manipulation of data, the corruption of data. The threat is not limited, obviously, to hackers on the outside. An important dimension of our cases increasingly is insiders with an axe to grind with knowledge of a system and not just privileged access. Employees who are willing to sell their knowledge to the highest bidder. Let me say a few words about the impact of recent attacks. These are more than just attacks on our infrastructure. They're attacks on the private sector and the public sector, on employees and customers. They're attacks on reputation. They're attacks on security, obviously, also attacks on fundamental rights. We see the Sony attack fundamentally as an attack on free speech. This was North Korea unhappy with the content of a particular film that Sony was looking to release, and they looked to wipe out that content before it could be broadcast. They quite literally shut Sony down because they didn't like the content of a movie. That obviously sets a very dangerous precedent. The behavior of all these threat actors is behavior that we think is susceptible to deterrence. And so the FBI is working very hard to get us to a place where we are not accepting intrusions as some kind of new normal. We think we have to be more predictive and less reactive, as government certainly, but also as members of the private sector and academia. And I think there are three main ways to go about being less reactive and more predictive. First, we can start by reducing our vulnerabilities. And for our part, we think the FBI has a role to play there in helping people understand what hackers and cyber criminals are after and how they're coming after it. All of us, government and private, can harden our targets and better secure our data and our networks. We can make cybersecurity a priority at all levels. Second, and this is where the FBI, I think, has the main role to play, we can work to eliminate the threat. I know we can't eliminate every threat or every vulnerability, but we can find those responsible and hold them accountable, whether through prosecution or publicity or economic sanctions. Third, I think we can all focus, if an attack has happened, on mitigating the damage better. I also think there's a role the Bureau can play here, and that is helping people understand, so what happened in your system, who did it and why, so you can patch and repair and protect much more quickly. For the FBI's part, we are focused, as I said, on trying to help eliminate the threat through attribution and imposing costs on the actors. Our strategy to do that has 5 parts that are pretty simple. The first is we're trying very hard to focus ourselves. There is a challenge in all things cyber, and that is the normal framework through which the FBI views our work, which is physical location, answering the question, where did it happen, and then assigning the work to that field office. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense when it comes to cyber, because often the physical manifestation of a threat is not at the core of the threat. It happens to be seen at a company in Indiana or in Texas. And so what we're trying to do is not be bound by that normal paradigm of physical location, and instead ask ourselves, who in the FBI is best equipped to respond to this threat, to understand this threat, and track this threat? And then we work to assign that work based on expertise. So if the Little Rock office shows great chops in dealing with a particular dimension of one of those 5 sets of actors, they will get that work in what we call a cyber threat team model. We will assign the threat where the ability is, and then allow 4 other offices to help based on physical manifestation of the threat, because we still need to interact with the executives of the victim company and work on mitigating the damage that they've suffered. But this cyber threat team model, which we've been doing for a little over a year now, seems to be working in the FBI and has created a very healthy competition inside the organization where people want to become expert in a particular threat so that they can own it without regard to where the victims may reside. And the second thing we're trying to do as part of this internal focus is bring all of our expertise to bear in our most important matters. We've formed something called the CAT, which is the Cyber Action Team, which is made up of experts, special agents, and forensic experts of different kinds from around the organization. And they deploy like one of our counterterrorism fly teams, where we will send people to an incident in the United States or anywhere around the world. If there's a terrorist attack, we're now doing the same with cyber incidents to focus our resources and our expertise in the same place. And obviously, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about this in my remarks, we are focusing ourselves to make sure we have great technology for our troops and that we attract and retain great people, which is an enormous challenge for all of us. So that's the first part of our strategy. Let's focus ourselves. The second part of our strategy is, how can we shrink the world? The bad guys, whether they're nation states or hacktivists or people operating a ransomware syndicate, have made the world very, very small because they're moving at the speed of light and able to do work from their basement in their pajamas halfway around the world. And so we're working very hard to shrink the world within the federal government to be much clearer and more nimble about who does the work. This has involved a great deal of discussion, which has been very productive, among actors like DHS, including Secret Service and the FBI, so we have clear understanding as to who's doing what. We want to get to a place where it doesn't matter who a victim calls. Just as in terrorism, it doesn't matter where that lead comes in, it's assigned very quickly to the right people. And then the most important manifestation of this effort to shrink our world is our National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, which sits outside of Washington. The NCI-JTF is 20 federal agencies sitting together deconflicting the work and dividing up the tasks. Third part of our strategy is to impose costs. We're shrinking the world, organizing ourselves and focusing better so that we can make people feel our breath on the back of their neck, physically ideally, but metaphorically, if they're sitting at a computer keyboard engaging in a cyber intrusion. We've tried to do this through locking people up, laying hands on people, through naming people and shaming them, and through economic sanctions so that people understand, whether you're a nation state or an individual, it's not a freebie to kick in a door in the United States and steal that which matters most to us. Fourth part of our strategy is to help our state and local partners who need every bit as much as we do to become digitally literate and to investigate all manner of offenses that when we're focusing our work, we don't have time to get to. There are probably people in this audience who have gotten an email from me from Nigeria asking you to wire me some money. Don't do it. I don't need your money, and I'm not in Nigeria. But all manner of frauds are being brought to the attention of our state and local counterparts. We have to do a better job of helping them get the equipment and the expertise they need to react to that. And there's some great work going on there between us and Secret Service to offer that. The fifth part of our strategy is the one I wanted to spend the most time on, and that is we simply must get better at working with the private sector. You all have heard this, but this is at the core of our being effective, because all of the information we need to understand the threat actors, to impose costs on them, and to mitigate sits on private enterprise in the United States. That's a great thing. 99% of the infrastructure is in private hands in this country. So if we're going to be effective, they have to tell us things, and we have to tell them things in a good way. But according to a recent study, about 20% of those in the private sector in the United States who had suffered computer intrusions actually turned to law enforcement. That means 80% of the victims in this country are not talking to us. We have to get to a place where it becomes routine for there to be an exchange, an appropriate, lawful exchange of information between those victims and government. First and foremost, because we need that information to figure out who's behind the attack. Now, this is where there may be an apparent divergence in interest, that a private enterprise may be thinking, I don't care that much about who's behind it, I need to get over it. But if you're going to avoid being victimized again and again, you need to understand that our interests are aligned in finding who did it and imposing costs. And speed matters here, both for the victim enterprise and for the government, because the threat is moving at the speed of light. We understand very, very well concerns about competitive advantage in the marketplace. People who've been victimized worry very much about loss of investor confidence, public perception, and their reputation. We know they're worried about what's this going to do to our operations. How are we going to deal with regulators over this if we start talking to the FBI, and is there civil liability? We understand that you are victims, and we will treat private enterprise that has been victims like the victims they are. We have done this many, many times. We know how to minimize the disruption to an operation. We know how to protect privacy. We will not share data about your employees or your operations. And we will make clear at the very start what the rules of the road are. What happens to what you've given us, who will see it, what we'll do with it. I was the general counsel at 2 different private enterprises, as you heard, before I came back to government. And I know that general counsels are conservative weenies, and that is what they are paid to do, to ask those hard questions, to understand, so what's happening, what will they do, what our exposure might be. We will have all of those conversations because we understand they're reasonable conversations. We also understand that it's not just cyber with you. Often it is cyber plus something else. There's an HR problem. There is a contract problem. There's a business supply chain problem. There's even radicalization problems. The beauty of working with the FBI is we are cyber plus as well, because we're cyber plus counterterrorism, cyber plus counterintelligence, cyber plus criminal, cyber plus international. People ask us all the time, so what do you need us to do? Get to know us before there is a storm. Sony is a great example of tremendous pain for an enterprise, but also of an ability on the FBI's part to help them quickly because we knew them. We knew their CISO, we knew their IT people, we were there within hours. Every single enterprise in the United States has a relationship with the fire department, where they make sure the fire department understands their facility, understands the general contours of what their campus looks like. My advice to private enterprise is you ought to have that kind of relationship with the FBI, We don't want your content, right? Even in the midst of an attack, we don't want to read your memos. We don't want to read your emails. We need to understand how we can quickly get the indicators of attack so we can change the actor's behavior. I want to say a brief word as I close about encryption. There's been some minor media coverage of litigation involving the FBI and Apple. And in a very, very important way, I'm very glad that the litigation between the FBI and Apple and San Bernardino has ended, because it really was about getting access to that phone, a 5C running iOS 9. And I know I've said this many times, I'll keep saying it. That is the reason the Department of Justice brought that action, to get us access in a very, very important investigation to a particular device. It's good that we have now found a way into that device. It would be bad if the conversation this has started ended. Right? I think it's very, very important that we understand there is a collision going on between values we all share, between privacy and security. Right? Privacy is a wonderful thing. I love encryption. I love privacy. I even find superficially attractive the notion that no one will ever be able to look at my personal device. But here's the conversation we have to have. There has never been a time in the 240 years of our country where privacy was absolute. Right? In our houses, in our cars, in our conversations, we have reasonable expectation of privacy. All those expectations can be overcome with appropriate predication and oversight. We are moving to a place in American life where, because we live our lives on these devices, as I do, the notion that they will be immune to judicial process takes us to a place we've never lived before. And my only request is that we talk about the costs of that. A group of companies and executives sent a letter to President Obama last year where they urged him not to do anything to, in their words, weaken encryption, which is a term that confuses me a little bit. But they urged him, and they talked about all the benefits of encryption. As I read the letter, I thought, agree. Encryption protects us from so many bad people. But there was nothing in the letter about the costs. And I found that depressing, because it meant either these very, very smart people didn't understand the costs as well as they understood the tremendous benefits, or they weren't being fair-minded. And either one of those things was depressing to me. I don't believe the FBI should tell the American people how to govern themselves. I think the FBI should take the tools we have and use them as best we can, and tell the American people when the tools are being affected. That's what we're trying to do. I don't think companies should tell the American people how to govern themselves, but we should not drift to a place where wide swaths of American life become off-limits to judicial process without a serious adult conversation. So I'm in this job for another 7 years and 4 months, not that I'm counting. But I intend to continue to try and push that conversation. It doesn't fit on a tweet. It isn't great to have it in litigation. It's about values. It's about conflict among things we all care about. It can't be done in a snippet. It has to be a serious adult conversation. And so I'll do my best to facilitate that conversation. I hope you will join in that conversation. So as we talk about the cyber threat, I don't know whether we can stay ahead of the cyber threat. I know we need to constantly work to adjust, to be agile, and to be humble in the face of a threat that is different than any we've seen before. I hope we will continue to have conversation about how we might do that better as we try to shrink the world and impose costs. And I hope you will join in that other conversation about how do we keep the technology we treasure and get the safety and security that we need. I think together we can figure that out in a good way if we sit down and listen to each other with an open mind. So I thank you for listening to me here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Director Comey. I'm Randall Fort with Raytheon. Earlier this morning, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse spoke as a keynote and talked about the idea of active defense on the part of licensed individuals, and even talked about the possibility of using letters of marque and reprisal and so forth. That is, private sector actors becoming engaged and more actively defending against cyber intrusion, cyber attacks. I just wondered, what are your thoughts on that as a possible extension of this private sector cooperation, which you mentioned? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I am cautious and conservative about that. First of all, I think we need to make sure that we have clear rules of the road if we're going to go that way for cyber, for private actors to understand what they can and can't do. It also poses, to my mind, the mother of all deconfliction problems, because there's an enormous amount of work that's being done to protect the country in the classified space. And if private actors are wandering around that space, I worry very much about how that might work. That said, I'm certainly open to a conversation about how it might work. Ma'am.
Director, thank you so much for a very frank discussion this morning. My name is Carrie Ann. I'm from the OAS. In balancing the public good to regulate private sector in all the tools that they develop for our use as the end user, how do you see from the law enforcement or the prosecutor point of view to balance the need that you need the private sector to investigate, but at the same time we have to regulate them for the public interest and the public good?
Yeah, I don't know that there's an inconsistency there. We want people to, I mean, as I said, we're not asking for anything fancy when we talk about people helping us investigate. We want to understand what the indicators of intrusion are. And so it actually does not, in my mind, overlap as much with the substantive regulation that may be going on in any particular industry than people may think. That said, it's important, especially for those in highly regulated industries, to have conversations with us at the front end about what information they will have to share with the regulator if they also share it with us. So I guess that's my general reaction to it. Ma'am.
Yes, Mr. Director, Ellen Nakashima with Washington Post. I have a process question and a policy question. My process question is, the Obama administration has a vulnerabilities equities process by which the interagency can determine whether or not to submit a software vulnerability to disclose it to the software vendors so it can be patched, or whether to retain it so it can continue to be used by either law enforcement or the intelligence community. Can you tell me where the FBI stands now in determining whether the vulnerabilities used in the San Bernardino terrorist's phone should be submitted to this process?
Sure. We are in the midst of trying to sort that out, and that involves answering a key question, which is, what do we know about the vulnerability? And given that, is the process implicated? And that's something we've been sorting out for the last couple of weeks. I think we're close to a resolution that I'm not ready to make news with yet. But that's what it involves. As I understand the process, and I understand it reasonably well, is the threshold is, are we aware of a vulnerability? Or did we just buy a tool and don't have sufficient knowledge of the vulnerability that it would implicate the process? That's the conversation we've been having.
I.e., do you yourselves not actually own the vulnerability or know enough about the vulnerability?
Correct. That's the question that has to be answered as a threshold matter. And we're really close to sorting that out.
Okay. And my policy question is, some experts and indeed I think last week in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, some lawmakers have started to discuss the feasibility of beefing up the Bureau's own technical and forensic capabilities so that you can yourselves find vulnerabilities and with lawful process, turn them into exploits and use them to hack endpoints like iPhones or computers, so you don't have to serve orders on companies under the All Writs Act or go and spend upwards of $1.3 million to buy vulnerability or tool. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, I don't love it.
Why not?
Because it is, I hope we wouldn't get to that place. I hope the conversation we can have as a country would get us to something that is more scalable than that and doesn't put the FBI in the situation of an arms race with every device that's made. And what I mean by scalability is the problem is overwhelmingly a local law enforcement and state law enforcement problem. Mm-hmm. And so San Bernardino is a great example. We paid a ton of dough for a tool because it mattered so much for that investigation, but it works on a 5C running iOS 9, and so it's not scalable to other devices, and it's hard for us to figure out, so how is it going to be of use to people in important murder investigations around the country, for example? And so maybe we end up in a place like that, but I certainly wouldn't want to go there first. I'd want to figure out, is there some way that we can, in a sensible way, accommodate the values that we see in collision here short of that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, Director. I'm Harvey Rushikoff from the American Bar Association. And thank you for your service. You said it's, you believe, 7 years and 4 months left, but Director Mueller re-upped, so it's unclear what your length is.
They said that was a one-off.
I think the question I have is that a number of years ago, we started InfraGard at the Bureau, and you've now elevated that up into your direct office.
Yep.
So I'm kind of curious of how that reach out is going to affect your strategic plan. And speaking on, I'm still part of the General Counsel Private Sector Winnie Group. There is that notion of liability issue, and now DHS is the portal to go through for that the Bureau doesn't have that same power. So I'm kind of curious how you guys are thinking through how to do the private sector relationship when DHS appears to be the only entity that has that thing that the general counsels are looking for.
Yeah, thanks for that. One of the reasons that we elevated InfraGard is, as I mentioned in this speech, critical to our strategy is more effective interaction with the people who are the victims. And so InfraGard is a critical vehicle to that. It knits us together in ways that make good sense to me. With respect to the second piece, what was the second piece again?
That the issue is that the entity now, as a result of
right.
statute, is DHS and not the Bureau.
Yeah, well, I don't know yet exactly how that's going to work. DHS is charged with building a portal, so if folks want to get liability protection, they send the threat report in there. In theory, it will allow the almost real-time sharing with those of us who have responsibility for investigating. So in theory, it should work about the same way. And I know general counsels have to make cost-benefit analyses all the time. What I've suggested to my former general counsel colleagues is Sony should have changed the game, that people should be thinking about the cost-benefit analysis, the risk analysis of cooperating with the government in a different way, given the existential nature of the threat, but it requires a conversation in nearly every case. So I think what we'll end up is information will be sent to the portal, it'll zip out to those of us who investigate, and at the same time we'll be having the conversations. Because there's no substitute for human-to-human conversations. So what do you all need, and who's going to get it, and where will it work? That can't be done through a portal. Yeah.
Hi, Director. Thank you for coming today. So appreciate your comments. I'm Tony Cole from FireEye. And what I'd like to hear is your thoughts really on where you feel the FBI is succeeding well in international relations with law enforcement like Europol, Interpol, and where it's not succeeding and what you could do to actually make it better.
It's working really well, as you would expect, throughout the EU, but especially in the former Soviet states that are the source of so much technically trained talent that has gone sideways. People have gone into criminal enterprise. So we've embedded analytic resources and special agent resources in a number of different places where it's working really well to help us lay hands on people who think they're otherwise immune. And I think that's sending a pretty good and scary message, which is what it's intended to be. It bumps, obviously, in places like Russia and China. Although China, there's been some positive conversations. I was there 3 weeks ago, and we seem to have agreed upon a framework for what is nation-state action appropriate, that is intelligence collection, and what is theft. And there is signs of progress in making that in the Chinese helping us impose costs on actors engaged in theft. Probably too early for me to give you a hard verdict on that, but enough positive sounds and positive motion that I'm reasonably optimistic. Less so in Russia. We still have a problem with criminals finding safe haven inside of that country, but even their criminals like to travel to warm weather.
Thank you.
Okay. Sir, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Director. Elias Kroll with Foreign Policy Magazine. I'd like to follow up on the question of government hacking. You've expressed a degree of reluctance to the idea that the FBI is going to be more reliant on exploits in order to gain access to encrypted communications and other secure systems. But at the same time, the FBI is currently using what I think you call mostly network investigatory techniques in order to gain access to child porn networks and other sophisticated investigations. How do you square the Bureau's reliance on those kinds of techniques with that reluctance to embrace hacking techniques to address the going dark problem?
I don't see a conflict. There will always be a need in sophisticated sort of corner cases for us with judicial authority to be able to use techniques. But I don't see that as the answer for the wide swath of work that we do and that our partners in state and local law enforcement do. Right? A particular network investigative technique that a judge approves for a mass child porn ring is not scalable and not all that useful to someone who's investigating a homicide in Louisiana and needs access to information that they otherwise can't get to. So I think we'll always need both in our toolboxes because we're always going to have sophisticated actors using sophisticated techniques against us. But in the main, I don't see us becoming a prolific hacker being the answer to our public safety problem. That's how I think about it. All right, thank you all. Yeah.